The wind swept across the Matanuska Valley, carrying with it the promise of another harsh winter. Sam Mackenzie knew this place. He had patrolled these remote stretches of the Alcan Highway for 2 decades as an Alaska state trooper navigating treacherous ice roads and responding to calls that often came too late. But the disappearance of Rachel and Evan Torres had changed everything. They were presumed victims of a tragic accident, but when Mackenzie discovers their van emerging from 7 years of frozen silence, he begins to uncover a truth so sinister no one could have imagined. The call had come at dawn, crackling through his radio with the static that always accompanied transmissions from the outer reaches. A local hunter had stumbled upon something while tracking a wounded moose, the dented rear bumper of a vehicle barely visible beneath what remained of a massive snowdrift. Mackenzie had driven the 90 minutes from Anchorage in contemplative silence, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel as memories surfaced like debris from a thaw. He remembered Rachel Torres as she'd appeared in the missing persons photographs, 24 years old, auburn hair catching sunlight, green eyes bright with the optimism of a woman embarking on a new life. Her husband Evan had been older, 32, with the calloused hands of someone who understood hard work. They'd been driving north to scout locations for a wilderness lodge, a dream that had taken years to finance and plan. The last confirmed sighting placed them at a gas station in Glen Ellen, purchasing supplies and asking directions to a remote tract of land Evan's business partner had recommended. Now, as Mackenzie parked his truck beside the recovery crew's equipment, he felt the familiar weight of unfinished business settle across his shoulders. The van sat partially excavated, its blue paint faded but recognizable. Windows, intact, doors closed, as if Rachel and Evan had simply stepped away for a moment. 7 years ago. The recovery supervisor, a grizzled man named Kowalski, approached with a clipboard and a grim expression. "Strange thing, Mackenzie. Vehicle's in good shape considering. No bodies inside, but there's plenty of personal effects. Looks like they were planning to stay out here for a while." Mackenzie nodded, pulling on latex gloves as he approached the van. The wilderness had preserved it like a time capsule, the sub-zero temperatures acting as nature's own evidence locker. Through the driver's side window, he could see road maps spread across the dashboard, a thermos still upright in the cup holder, a rifle case lying empty on the back seat. The questions that had haunted him for 7 years suddenly felt urgent again. Where were Rachel and Evan Torres? Why had they abandoned their van with supplies still inside? And most troubling of all, if this had been a simple case of travelers getting lost in Alaska's unforgiving wilderness, why had every search effort yielded nothing but silence? The van's interior held the stale scent of confinement and cold metal. But underneath, Mackenzie detected something else, the lingering traces of human habitation. Canned peaches, beef stew, condensed milk, enough supplies for a week in the wilderness, all neatly arranged in a cardboard box behind the driver's seat. The methodical organization suggested preparation, not panic. Mackenzie ran his fingers along the dashboard, feeling for the subtle vibrations that might reveal hidden compartments or damage. The maps told their own story, state highway routes marked in red ink with handwritten notes in the margins. Webb's recommendation read one notation beside a circled area 40 miles north of the highway. Another note in different handwriting, feminine flowing, simply said, "Home." The empty rifle case bothered him most. A 3006 Springfield, judging by the foam padding expensive enough that abandoning it made no sense, unless it hadn't been abandoned by choice. 7 years ago, when the Torres case had first landed on his desk, Mackenzie had coordinated search efforts across a 100-square-mile area. Helicopter sweeps revealed nothing but endless wilderness. Ground teams had combed ravines and creek beds until the first snows made further efforts impossible. He'd interviewed the gas station attendant in Glen Ellen, who remembered the couple as polite but anxious, purchasing more supplies than most travelers carried for a simple scouting trip. The official investigation had stalled within 6 months. Without bodies or evidence of foul play, the case was classified as a probable wilderness accident. People disappeared in Alaska with sobering regularity. Hypothermia, bear attacks, falls into hidden crevasses. The wilderness didn't discriminate between the prepared and the foolish. But Mackenzie had never fully accepted that explanation. Something about the timeline bothered him. Rachel and Evan had contacted Rachel's sister in Oregon just 2 days before vanishing, excited about their progress and planning to return south within the week. Their bank accounts showed no unusual activity, their credit cards unused after that final gas station purchase. It was as if they'd simply evaporated. Now, crouched inside their preserved van, Mackenzie felt the familiar frustration of 7 years ago returning. The physical evidence suggested an orderly departure, no signs of struggle, personal items still in place. But the emotional evidence pointed toward something darker. He'd learned during his 2 decades in law enforcement that the most dangerous predators were often those closest to their victims. Outside, the recovery crew worked with practiced efficiency, photographing every angle before the van would be transported to the state crime lab. Mackenzie knew that within hours, this site would return to its natural state, showing no sign of the drama that had unfolded here. Alaska was like that, vast enough to swallow secrets whole, patient enough to keep them for decades. The wind picked up, sending loose snow swirling around the excavation site. Winter was coming early this year, and Mackenzie felt time pressing against him like the approaching storm. Back at the Anchorage field office, Mackenzie spread the Torres case files across his desk like a map of betrayal. 3 names stared back at him from witness statements and interview transcripts, each representing a different kind of threat to Rachel and Evan's future. The van's discovery had breathed new life into what had become a cold case, and these 3 men, Marcus Webb, Dale Hartman, and Victor Kozlov, suddenly seemed less like background characters and more like active participants in a deadly drama. Marcus Webb, Evan's business partner, occupied the first folder. Webb had provided the initial financing for the Wilderness Lodge venture, contributing $40,000 to match Evan's investment. The partnership agreement revealed a man desperate to succeed. Webb had leveraged his Anchorage home and borrowed against his son's college fund to raise the capital. More troubling, Webb had been the one to recommend the remote scouting location where Rachel and Evan had vanished. His alibi for that week had been solid, confirmed by his ex-wife and business associates, but Mackenzie had learned that alibis in Alaska could be as deceptive as the landscape itself. Dale Hartman's file painted a portrait of obsession wearing the mask of concern. Rachel's ex-boyfriend from college, Hartman, had followed her to Alaska after she'd moved there to be with Evan. The restraining order Rachel had filed 6 months before her disappearance told a story of escalating harassment. Unwanted phone calls, flowers left on her doorstep, incidents of Hartman appearing at her workplace uninvited. He'd been questioned extensively after the disappearance. His apartment searched, his movements during the critical week scrutinized. Nothing conclusive had emerged, but Mackenzie remembered the man's demeanor during interviews, grief that seemed genuine, yet somehow performed. Victor Kozlov represented a different category of threat entirely. The Russian immigrant operated a salvage business near Glen Ellen, legitimate on paper, but suspected by local law enforcement of facilitating smuggling operations along remote wilderness routes. Kozlov's property bordered the area where Rachel and Evan had been heading, and he'd been known to react violently to trespassers. 2 years before the Torres disappearance, he'd been arrested for assault after confronting hikers he claimed were spying on his operations. The charges had been dropped when the victims declined to testify. Mackenzie studied the 3 photographs clipped to the files. Webb looked like what he was, a middle-aged businessman fighting to stay afloat, his smile tight with the strain of maintaining appearances. Hartman appeared younger, his college fraternity background evident in his confident posture, but his eyes held an intensity that suggested depths better left unexplored. Kozlov's mugshot showed a man shaped by hard experience, his scarred face reflecting someone comfortable with violence as a problem-solving tool. 7 years ago, each man had been questioned, investigated, and ultimately cleared due to lack of evidence. But Mackenzie understood that innocence and insufficient evidence were not the same thing. The wilderness had hidden Rachel and Evan's fate, but it had also preserved their van and potentially the truth about which of these 3 men had blood on his hands. The call from the crime lab came 3 days after the van's recovery, interrupting Mackenzie's morning coffee with news that would redirect the entire investigation. Evidence technician Maria Santos spoke with the precise cadence of someone accustomed to delivering findings that could alter lives. "We found something in the glove compartment that wasn't in your initial inventory, Sam. A child's winter mitt." Mackenzie set down his cup, the coffee suddenly tasting bitter. Child's mitt. Size small, maybe for an 8 or 9-year-old. Good quality, hand-knitted. There's a name tag sewn inside, Tommy W. The fibers don't match anything else in the vehicle, and it's definitely not something the Torres couple would have been carrying. The implications hit Mackenzie like a physical blow. Rachel and Evan had no children. None of the witness statements mentioned a child accompanying them. Yet here was evidence that a young boy had been inside their van, his winter gear left behind like a calling card in the most overlooked hiding place. Mackenzie drove to the evidence facility with his mind racing through possibilities. Had Rachel and Evan picked up a hitchhiker, rescued a lost child? The scenario seemed increasingly unlikely given the remote location where they'd vanished. More disturbing was the growing certainty that this mitt represented a crucial piece of information that had somehow been overlooked during the original investigation. Under the fluorescent lights of the evidence room, the mitt looked impossibly small, hand-knitted in blue and white with a Nordic pattern that spoke of someone who cared enough to spend hours creating something beautiful for a child. The name tag was sewn with the same careful attention, Tommy W., in small, neat letters. Tommy W. Mackenzie's thoughts immediately turned to Marcus Webb, but Webb had never mentioned having a son during any of the interviews. The file contained background checks, financial records, personal references. Surely a child would have been noted somewhere in the documentation. 2 hours of records searching later, Mackenzie found his answer buried in Webb's divorce proceedings. Thomas Webb Jr., 8 years old at the time of his parents' separation, custody awarded to the mother with weekend visitation rights for the father. The divorce had been finalized just 3 months before Rachel and Evan's disappearance, explaining why Tommy had never appeared in the initial background checks focused on Webb's business relationships. Mackenzie stared at the custody agreement, feeling pieces of a darker puzzle beginning to align. If Webb's son had been in the van, it changed everything about the timeline, the motivations, and most critically, the number of potential victims. 3 adults planning a business venture was one thing. 3 adults responsible for a vulnerable child was something else entirely. The mitt lay on the evidence table like an accusation, its cheerful colors a stark contrast to the implications it carried. Mackenzie had spent decades learning to read the stories that evidence told, and this story was beginning to whisper of betrayal that went deeper than business partnerships or romantic jealousy. This was about a father's desperation and a child's innocence, a combination that had proven deadly in the vast indifference of the Alaskan wilderness. Webb's auto repair shop sat on the outskirts of Anchorage like a monument to diminished dreams. What had once been a thriving business now showed the telltale signs of financial distress. Half-empty service bays, outdated equipment, and the hollow echo of a workspace designed for more activity than it currently saw. Mackenzie found Webb hunched over paperwork in a cramped office that smelled of motor oil and desperation. "Mr. Webb." Mackenzie placed the evidence bag containing Tommy's mitt on the cluttered desk. "We need to talk about your son." Webb's face went through a series of micro-expressions that Mackenzie had learned to read during 2 decades of interrogation, surprise recognition, calculation, and finally, the resigned exhaustion of someone whose carefully constructed lies were about to collapse. Webb set down his pen with the deliberate movements of a man buying time to think. "I don't understand what you're implying, Trooper Mackenzie. Tommy was in that van. This is his mitt found in the glove compartment." Mackenzie kept his voice level professional. "What I'm trying to understand is why you never mentioned that your 8-year-old son was with Rachel and Evan Torres when they disappeared." Webb's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a coffee cup, the liquid inside cold and filmed over. The silence stretched between them like a frozen lake, beautiful on the surface, but concealing dangerous depths. Finally, Webb spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't supposed to be there. The admission opened floodgates that Mackenzie had sensed were straining for 7 years. Webb's financial situation was worse than anyone had realized. The lodge venture represented his last chance to avoid bankruptcy, but even that had been built on borrowed time and borrowed money. Insurance investigators had been circling his business for months, questioning claims and examining his books with the persistence of scavengers. Tommy had been asking to come along on the scouting trip for weeks. Webb continued, his voice gaining strength as the truth emerged. "Rachel was good with kids, and Evan thought it would be educational. I said no, but Tommy..." Webb's voice broke. "He hid in the back of the van. We didn't discover him until they were already 2 hours north of Anchorage." Mackenzie felt the familiar chill that accompanied the revelation of crucial information. And then what happened? Webb's eyes darted to the window where late afternoon shadows were lengthening across the empty parking lot. The gesture reminded Mackenzie of prey animals scanning for escape routes, and he realized that Marcus Webb was far more dangerous than he'd initially appeared. A desperate man protecting secrets had already proven capable of making terrible decisions. "That's when everything went wrong," Webb said finally. "That's when I realized what I was going to have to do." The temperature in the small office seemed to drop 10 degrees as Mackenzie understood that he was no longer investigating a disappearance. He was sitting across from a killer. Mackenzie left Webb's auto shop with more questions than answers, but with the certainty that the businessman's confession was only the beginning. Webb's admission about Tommy's presence had been too calculated, too practiced, the words of someone who'd been rehearsing this moment for 7 years. Before confronting Webb further, Mackenzie needed to eliminate the other suspects, starting with the man whose obsession had made him the most obvious candidate from the beginning. Dale Hartman's apartment complex in Midtown Anchorage reflected the transient nature of someone who'd followed an ex-girlfriend across a continent. Generic furniture, minimal personal touches, and the sterile atmosphere of temporary housing. But the walls told a different story entirely. Photographs of Rachel covered nearly every surface. Casual shots that appeared to be taken without her knowledge. Images lifted from social media and printed in obsessive detail, candid pictures captured through restaurant windows and across parking lots. Mackenzie counted 47 separate photos, creating a shrine to a woman who'd made it clear she wanted nothing to do with the man who'd built it. Hartman's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had been waiting 7 years to tell someone about the strange behavior she'd witnessed. "He would leave every weekend, sometimes for days," she told Mackenzie over tea in her immaculate kitchen. "Always heading north, always alone. When he came back, he'd be different. Agitated, sometimes angry enough that I could hear him talking to himself through the walls." The pattern emerged through credit card records and gas receipts that Hartman had preserved with the same meticulous care he'd applied to documenting Rachel's movements. Every weekend for 6 months before the disappearance, he'd driven north toward Glen Allen, staying in cheap motels and purchasing camping supplies. The timeline painted a picture of escalating surveillance, a man who'd transformed his grief into a systematic campaign of observation. But as Mackenzie studied the evidence, he began to recognize something that the original investigators had missed. Hartman's obsession was genuine, but it was also transparent. His behavior was too obvious, too well documented, too easily discovered. A man planning murder didn't typically leave a paper trail that led directly to his victim's last known location. The realization crystallized when Mackenzie found Hartman's journal hidden beneath the mattress with the confidence of someone who believed his privacy was absolute. The entries revealed a man tormented by rejection, but fundamentally incapable of violence. "Saw Rachel at the grocery store today," read one typical entry. "She looked happy. I want her to be happy, even if it's not with me. Maybe I should stop watching. Maybe this isn't love anymore." The final entry, dated 3 days before Rachel and Evan's disappearance, contained a revelation that changed everything. "Heard from Marcus Webb today. He says Rachel and Evan are going on a scouting trip this weekend. He seemed nervous when he told me, like he was testing my reaction. I think he knows I've been following her. Maybe he's trying to warn me off." Mackenzie closed the journal, understanding finally that Dale Hartman hadn't been a perpetrator, he'd been a convenient distraction. Someone had known about his obsession and used it as cover, creating a suspect so obvious that investigators would focus their attention in the wrong direction while the real killer operated in the shadows. The drive to Victor Kozlov's salvage yard required Mackenzie to navigate 40 miles of deteriorating road that seemed designed to discourage visitors. Snow had begun falling that morning, fat flakes that clung to his windshield and reduced visibility to mere yards. By the time he reached Kozlov's property, the world had transformed into a monochrome landscape where the boundaries between sky and earth blurred into threatening obscurity. Kozlov's operation sprawled across 10 acres of industrial desolation, rusted machinery, abandoned vehicles, and storage containers arranged with the haphazard logic of someone more concerned with concealment than efficiency. The main building, a corrugated metal structure that might charitably be called a warehouse, showed no lights despite the gathering darkness of the early afternoon storm. Mackenzie had come alone, a decision that felt increasingly unwise as he parked near the chain-link perimeter. His radio crackled with static communication with dispatch would be unreliable until the weather cleared. The isolation was absolute, exactly the kind of scenario where experienced officers made their final mistakes. Kozlov emerged from the warehouse before Mackenzie had fully exited his vehicle, moving with the deliberate pace of someone comfortable being approached by law enforcement. The Russian was smaller than his mugshot suggested, but his presence filled the space around him with the quiet menace of controlled violence. "Trooper Mackenzie," Kozlov said, his accent flavoring the words with old-world formality. "You are investigating the Torres matter again. I wondered when someone would return to ask the same questions." The conversation that followed revealed Kozlov to be more intelligent and more cooperative than Mackenzie had expected. Yes, he remembered Rachel and Evan Torres. Yes, they had contacted him about accessing the remote property where they'd planned to scout for their lodge. No, he had never met them in person. Their communication had been entirely through Marcus Webb, who had served as an intermediary. "Webb, he comes to me maybe 6-7 times over the years," Kozlov explained as they stood in the falling snow. "Always nervous, always asking about routes through the wilderness that avoid main roads. I tell him I am a legitimate businessman, but he insists he needs discretion for his clients." The intelligence Kozlov provided painted Webb in an increasingly suspicious light. The business partner had been far more involved in the logistics of Rachel and Evan's final trip than he'd ever admitted. Webb had scouted the routes arranged for access through Kozlov's property and even requested detailed maps of areas where cellular communication was impossible. But as Mackenzie prepared to leave, the weather turned vicious with the sudden violence that characterized Alaskan storms. What had been manageable snowfall became a whiteout condition that reduced visibility to arm's length. The temperature plummeted, and the wind began howling with enough force to rock Mackenzie's truck. "You cannot drive in this," Kozlov said, his earlier menace replaced by practical concern. "The road becomes impassable. Many vehicles have been lost in conditions like these." Mackenzie found himself trapped at the salvage yard, dependent on the hospitality of a man he'd come to investigate. But as the hours passed and Kozlov shared vodka and canned soup in his heated workshop, Mackenzie began to understand that the Russian's violent reputation masked a more complex character. Kozlov had indeed committed acts of violence, but they were defensive responses to perceived threats, not the calculated brutality required for multiple murders. By morning, when the storm had exhausted itself and the roads became passable again, Mackenzie knew that Victor Kozlov was guilty of many things, but not of killing Rachel Evan and Tommy Torres. The insurance records arrived by fax at 9:47 a.m., their mundane appearance belying the devastating story they told. Mackenzie spread the documents across his desk while outside Anchorage emerged from the previous night's storm under pale winter sunlight. The numbers on the pages represented more than financial planning. They were a roadmap to premeditated murder. Marcus Webb had increased the life insurance policies on Rachel and Evan Torres 6 weeks before their disappearance. Rachel's policy, originally set at $50,000 as part of the lodge partnership agreement, had been quietly raised to $200,000. Evan's had been increased from $75,000 to $300,000, but the most damning discovery was a policy Mackenzie hadn't known existed: a $150,000 life insurance policy on Thomas Webb Jr., purchased just 3 weeks before the fatal trip. Mackenzie studied the applications with the methodical attention of someone who understood that devils lived in details. Webb had signed as the beneficiary on all 3 policies, listing his business partnership with the Torres couple and his parental relationship with Tommy as justification. The premiums had been paid from the struggling auto repair shop's dwindling bank account, representing a significant financial burden for a man already facing bankruptcy. The timing was crucial. Webb's business records showed that insurance investigators had scheduled a comprehensive audit for the month following the disappearance. His creditors were demanding payment. His ex-wife was threatening to revoke his visitation rights due to unpaid child support and the lodge venture. His last hope for financial salvation was revealing itself to be built on over-optimistic projections and insufficient capital. A phone call to the insurance company's fraud investigation unit revealed additional disturbing details. Webb had been unusually persistent about clarifying the policy's coverage for wilderness accidents, asking specific questions about death benefits when bodies were never recovered. He'd also inquired about the timeline for claim processing and the documentation required to establish presumptive death in Alaska. Mackenzie felt the familiar weight of certainty settling over him like armor. Webb hadn't just killed 3 people, he'd planned their deaths with the calculating precision of an accountant balancing ledgers. The lodge venture had been a fiction designed to lure Rachel and Evan into the wilderness. Tommy's presence had been an unexpected complication, but Webb had solved that problem with the same ruthless efficiency he'd applied to everything else. The morning sun streaming through Mackenzie's office window seemed to lose its warmth as he contemplated the coldness required to ensure your own child's life and then arrange his death. Webb had transformed his son from a custody battle prize into a financial asset, reducing the boy's worth to the dollar amount that would solve his father's problems. Mackenzie reached for his phone to request backup, but the line was dead. Outside, he could see Webb's distinctive blue pickup truck parked across the street from the field office, the engine running, exhaust vapor rising into the cold air like smoke signals. Webb had been watching, waiting, and now he knew that his 7 years of freedom were coming to an end. Mackenzie's radio crackled to life, with Webb's voice distorted by static but unmistakably urgent. "Trooper Mackenzie, this is Marcus Webb. I'm at the site where you found the van. There's something here you need to see. Something I should have told you 7 years ago." The transmission cut to silence, leaving Mackenzie staring at the handset while storm clouds gathered on the horizon with ominous speed. Webb's pickup truck was no longer parked across the street, and Mackenzie realized he'd been watching for exactly this moment when the insurance records would force the final confrontation between hunter and prey. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. But Mackenzie also understood that Webb possessed information that might never emerge through conventional investigation. The man had lived with his crimes for 7 years, and desperation had made him dangerous in ways that standard police procedure couldn't address. If Mackenzie wanted answers, he would have to meet Webb on the killer's chosen ground. The drive north took 90 minutes through deteriorating weather conditions that transformed the familiar highway into a treacherous passage between white-capped mountains. Mackenzie had radioed his destination to dispatch before leaving cell tower range, but he knew that backup would be hours away even under ideal conditions. The approaching storm would make rescue impossible until it passed. Webb's truck sat empty at the excavation site, its driver's side door hanging open as if its occupant had departed in haste. Fresh footprints led away from the vehicle toward a stand of spruce trees that marked the beginning of truly wild country. Mackenzie followed the trail, his service weapon drawn, while fat snowflakes began falling with increasing intensity. He found Webb standing beside a granite outcropping that provided partial shelter from the wind. The businessman had aged a decade since their conversation at the auto shop. His face gaunt with the strain of carrying secrets that had grown too heavy to bear alone. In his hands, he held a .30-06 rifle, the same caliber that had been missing from the empty case in the Torres van. "I've been coming here every winter," Webb said without preamble, his voice barely audible above the rising wind. "Checking to make sure the snow stayed deep enough to keep them hidden. 7 years of holding my breath every time the weather warmed." Mackenzie kept his weapon trained on Webb while calculating distances and escape routes. The storm was intensifying with the violence that characterized Alaskan weather, reducing visibility and making precise movement dangerous. Within hours, this location would become inaccessible to everyone except those prepared for wilderness survival. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. Webb continued, his grip tightening on the rifle. Tommy was supposed to stay home. Rachel and Evan were supposed to die alone in an accident that no one would question. Insurance money, fresh start, everyone moves on. The confession Mackenzie had been seeking for 7 years was finally emerging, but it was coming at the cost of his own safety. Webb had chosen this location not just for its isolation, but because it was where his original plan had unfolded. Here, in the indifferent wilderness that had concealed his crimes, he intended to add one more body to the count. The rifle shot shattered the wilderness silence, but Webb's aim was disrupted by the wind gusting through the trees with hurricane force. Mackenzie dove behind the granite outcropping as the bullet sparked off rock inches from his head, the ricochet whining away into the storm's fury. The temperature had plummeted to 20 below zero, and the falling snow had transformed into a whiteout that reduced the world to arm's-length visibility. Mackenzie's 20 years of Alaska experience became his lifeline as he used the terrain and weather to his advantage. He moved low and quiet, circling through the spruce trees, while Webb struggled to track him through the blizzard conditions. The killer's desperation made him sloppy. Mackenzie could hear him crashing through undergrowth, his labored breathing carrying on the wind. "You don't understand the pressure I was under." Webb's voice cracked as he shouted into the storm. "Bankruptcy, divorce, Tommy's mother threatening to take him away permanently. The insurance money was the only way out." Mackenzie flanked left, using a fallen log for cover while his fingers went numb despite insulated gloves. Survival in these conditions required constant movement to prevent hypothermia, but movement also meant exposure. Webb fired again, the muzzle flash creating a brief orange bloom in the white void. "I told Tommy it was a game." Webb's confession continued, his voice growing more unhinged. "Hide in the van, surprise Uncle Evan and Aunt Rachel. He thought it was an adventure until I realized he'd seen too much." Mackenzie worked his way behind Webb's position, using the howling wind to mask his approach. The killer was breaking down completely now, the psychological weight of 7 years finally crushing his ability to maintain composure. But he still held the rifle, and desperation had made him lethal. The attack came when Webb turned to scan for movement. Mackenzie launched himself from cover, tackling the businessman around the waist and driving him into the snow. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air as both men rolled down a small embankment, fighting for control of the weapon while the storm raged around them. Webb was stronger than his appearance suggested, fueled by the manic energy of a cornered animal. They grappled in the deepening snow, each man's breath creating frozen clouds as they struggled. Mackenzie used his police training to gain leverage, but the treacherous footing and brutal cold sapped strength from both combatants. "3 people!" Webb gasped as Mackenzie managed to tear the rifle away. 3 people I had to kill because an 8-year-old couldn't follow simple instructions." The confession hung in the air between them as Webb collapsed into the snow, his energy finally spent. Around them, the wilderness continued its indifferent assault, caring nothing for human guilt or justice, only for the eternal struggle between survival and surrender. With the rifle secured and Webb's resistance broken, Mackenzie dragged the exhausted man toward the limited shelter of the granite outcropping. The storm showed no signs of abating, and hypothermia was becoming as immediate a threat as the confession he still needed to extract. Both men's survival depended on sharing body heat and finding protection from the relentless wind. Webb's story emerged in fragments between chattering teeth and exhausted gasps. Tommy had indeed hidden in the van, emerging only after they'd driven deep into the wilderness, where turning back would have meant disappointing the boy and risking questions about why a father couldn't control his own child. Rachel had been delighted by Tommy's surprise appearance. Evan had laughed and called it an adventure. Neither adult had suspected they were being led to their deaths. The plan was simple. Webb whispered, his face pale with cold and confession. Remote location, difficult terrain, easy to stage an accident. But with Tommy there, his voice broke. "I couldn't let him witness what I had to do to Rachel and Evan, and I couldn't let him go home and tell people about the trip." Mackenzie felt sick understanding the calculus that had sealed 3 innocent lives. Webb had made Tommy part of the insurance scheme precisely because his presence would make the murders seem more tragic and less suspicious. A grieving father who'd lost his business partners and his beloved son in a wilderness accident would receive sympathy rather than scrutiny. The actual killings had been brutally efficient. Webb had suggested they camp for the night, then used the rifle to shoot Evan first, claiming later that he'd thought he saw a bear. Rachel's death had been more difficult. She'd understood what was happening and tried to run. Tommy had been the hardest of all, not because Webb felt remorse, but because the boy had trusted his father completely, even as the rifle was raised. "I buried them 6 miles from here." Webb continued, his words barely audible above the storm. "Used the van to transport the bodies, then drove it back and arranged it to look like they'd gotten stuck and abandoned it. The snowfall that week covered everything perfectly." Mackenzie realized with growing horror that Webb had planned even the weather, studying meteorological patterns to ensure maximum snowfall during the critical period. The man had approached murder with the same methodical planning most people applied to vacation itineraries. The hardest part wasn't killing them, Webb said, his eyes unfocused with exhaustion and hypothermia. It was pretending to grieve. Attending the memorial services, accepting condolences, filing the insurance claims with just the right amount of reluctance. 7 years of performing sorrow for crimes I'd committed. As Webb's confession reached its conclusion, Mackenzie understood that justice would be complicated by logistics. They were both losing the battle against the cold, and rescue was still hours away. The killer who'd evaded capture for 7 years might yet claim one final victim, the man who'd finally uncovered his crimes. The sound of helicopter rotors cutting through the storm's fury came like salvation from the frozen hell that had nearly claimed both men. Mackenzie had managed to activate his emergency beacon during the final moments of Webb's confession, and the Alaska State Trooper search and rescue team had launched despite the dangerous conditions. The crew's thermal imaging equipment had located their heat signatures huddled against the granite outcropping, 2 figures barely distinguishable from the surrounding wilderness. As the rescue team loaded Webb onto a medical transport stretcher, the killer's hypothermia-addled mind produced one final revelation. "The life insurance on Tommy," he mumbled through blue lips. "I'd been planning it for months, even before the lodge idea. My own son was just collateral for a fresh start." Mackenzie watched the helicopter disappear into the gray sky, carrying with it the man who'd transformed 3 innocent lives into financial instruments. The storm was beginning to break, revealing patches of blue between the clouds, and Mackenzie felt the peculiar emptiness that followed the conclusion of cases that had consumed years of his life. The legal proceedings that followed would be thorough but predictable. Webb's confession, recorded on Mackenzie's digital device during their shared ordeal, would provide prosecutors with everything needed for conviction. The insurance companies would recover their money minus the investigative costs and legal fees that had multiplied over 7 years. Webb would face 3 counts of first-degree murder and spend the remainder of his life in prison, assuming he survived the inmates' traditional justice for those who killed children. But the true resolution lay 6 miles north of the van's discovery site, where Webb's directions led recovery teams to 3 graves, marked only by the patient accumulation of snow and time. Rachel Torres was found with her wedding ring still on her finger, buried in the dress she'd worn for what she'd believed would be an adventure with her husband. Evan lay beside her, his camping gear arranged as if he'd simply decided to rest forever beneath the Alaskan sky. Tommy was discovered separately, his small body wrapped in the same blue jacket he'd worn to hide in the van, still clutching a toy truck that had been his constant companion. Justice for Rachel Evan and Tommy Torres would come through the courts. Marcus Webb would face trial for his crimes. But the true justice Mackenzie believed would come in ensuring that their memory was protected and honored. As moonlight filtered through the window of his office where he completed the final paperwork, Mackenzie made a silent promise. He had spent a lifetime preparing for difficult journeys, and this, perhaps the most important one of all, would be faced with the same resilience and determination that had guided him for decades. The wilderness had kept its secrets for 7 years, but in the end, it had also revealed them. Alaska's vast indifference worked both ways, concealing evil and ultimately exposing it to those patient enough to listen to what the land was trying to say.
Thank you for listening to Brody's Stories. Until we meet again.